The bloodied sky ignited the horizon as Grace Sullivan clutched her father's pocket watch, the only piece of him she had left since the pneumonia took him 3 winters ago. The stagecoach rattled beneath her, dust billowing through the cracks as it lurched toward Nogales, Arizona, a border town that promised nothing but a teaching position and distance from the memories haunting her in Boston. "First time out west, miss." The elderly woman across from her smiled knowingly, her weathered face creasing like folded parchment. Grace nodded, tucking a stray auburn curl beneath her bonnet. "Yes, I've accepted a position at the schoolhouse in Nogales." "Brave girl." The woman's eyes narrowed with something between admiration and concern. "The territory has its beauty, but it's got teeth too. The wind out here speaks differently than back east." Grace had heard tales of the Western Territory's lawlessness, opportunity, danger. At 22, she'd lived a sheltered life in Massachusetts, teaching children of privilege whose biggest worry was a smudge on their copybooks. But after her father's passing, the family home and his medical practice debts consumed everything. When the letter arrived offering a position at a frontier school, she'd seized it like a drowning woman clutching driftwood. The stagecoach crested a hill, revealing the sprawling Sonoran desert below. Saguaro cacti stood like sentinels across the landscape, their arms reaching skyward in silent supplication. Grace felt her breath catch the vastness of it all, both terrifying and exhilarating. "We'll be in Nogales by nightfall," the driver called back. "God willing and the Apache peaceful." The elderly woman patted Grace's hand. "Don't mind him. The border's been quiet this year." As the sun began its descent, the wind picked up, whistling through the desert scrub with an eerie, hollow sound. Grace shivered despite the lingering heat. "Wind's got a voice out here," the woman said, noticing Grace's discomfort. "Folks say it carries messages from those who have passed on." Grace swallowed hard. Her father had been a man of science, dismissing such notions as superstition. Yet she couldn't deny the way the sound cut through her, raising gooseflesh along her arms. It reminded her of her father's labored breathing in those final days, persistent, haunting. The stagecoach rolled into Nogales as twilight draped the town in purple shadows. It was larger than Grace had expected, a proper street lined with adobe buildings, wooden storefronts, and oil lamps being lit by a town worker moving methodically down the thoroughfare. "Miss Sullivan." A stern-faced woman approached as Grace descended from the coach on wobbling legs. "I'm Mrs. Hargrove, head of the school board." Grace straightened her travel-worn skirts. "Yes, madam. Thank you for meeting me. We've arranged lodging at the Widow Miller's boarding house. It's respectable and close to the schoolhouse." Mrs. Hargrove eyed Grace's 2 modest trunks. "I trust your journey was uneventful." "Quite," Grace replied, though her mind flashed to the haunting wind that had followed them across the desert. As they walked down the main street, Grace took in her new home. Nogales straddled the border between the Arizona Territory and Mexico, a fact evident in the mixture of languages drifting from the saloon and the trading post. Cowboys and vaqueros alike moved through the dusky street, some nodding respectfully at the women, others averting their eyes. "School begins on Monday," Mrs. Hargrove explained. 26 pupils ages 6 to 15. Some are quite behind in their studies. The last teacher. She hesitated. Well, she found frontier life unsuitable. Grace wondered what that meant but didn't ask. The wind gusted suddenly, sending dust swirling around them and rattling the shop signs overhead. The sound, that hollow, mournful howl, returned, and Grace felt tears spring unbidden to her eyes. Mrs. Hargrove didn't notice, busy pointing out the church, the general store, and finally the boarding house. "Here we are. Widow Miller runs a tight house. No gentlemen callers in private rooms, no liquor, no returning after 9 in the evening. The boarding house was a 2-story adobe structure with neat curtains in the windows. Inside, Mrs. Miller, a robust woman with silver-streaked hair pinned severely at her nape, showed Grace to a small but clean room on the second floor. Breakfast at 6, dinner at 6. Lunch you'll take at the school, Mrs. Miller explained. Bathing is Saturday evenings, laundry services extra. Left alone at last, Grace sank onto the narrow bed, exhaustion weighing her limbs. The room was sparse: a bed, a washstand, a small writing desk, and a wardrobe. A single window looked out toward the mountains rising dark against the night sky. As she unpacked her modest belongings, the wind rose again, rattling the glass in its frame. The sound sent a shiver through her, and tears welled in her eyes once more. It was foolish, she knew, to react so emotionally to mere weather. Yet something in that sound reached into her chest and squeezed her heart. Later, as she lay beneath the thin quilt, the wind continued its mournful conversation with the desert. Grace pressed her face into the pillow, tears soaking the fabric as she thought of her father. In Boston, she'd kept her grief contained, practical as he would have wanted. But here, with that wind speaking in voices she couldn't quite understand, the dam broke. Mourning brought clarity and purpose. Grace dressed in her most professional attire, a navy skirt and white shirtwaist with a cameo brooch at her throat. After a hearty breakfast of cornmeal mush and strong coffee, Mrs. Hargrove arrived to escort her to the schoolhouse. The building stood at the edge of town, a simple wooden structure with a bell tower. Inside, rows of benches faced a blackboard and teacher's desk. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. "The school supplies arrived last month, Mrs. Hargrove said, gesturing to a cabinet. "Books, slates, chalk, paper. We expect you to maintain inventory." Grace ran her fingers along the teacher's desk. "I'll prepare lessons today and tomorrow. Will the children have prior knowledge of arithmetic beyond basic sums?" "Some." "The Mendez children are quite bright, as are the Peterson twins. The ranch children attend sporadically during roundup and branding season." Mrs. Hargrove checked her pocket watch. "I must attend to other matters. The key is yours. Remember, Miss Sullivan, these children need discipline and knowledge to survive here." Alone in the schoolhouse, Grace began organizing materials and planning lessons. The familiar work calmed her, establishing a connection between her old life and new. By midday, she had arranged the primers by level and written out a schedule for recitations. The door creaked open, startling her from her work. "Madam," Mrs. Hargrove said the new teacher was here. A tall man stood in the doorway, hat in hand. Grace rose, smoothing her skirt. "I'm Miss Sullivan." "Ridge Quincy, madam, town marshal." He stepped inside, revealing broad shoulders beneath a dusty duster coat. A silver star glinted on his chest, and a revolver hung at his hip. Despite these markers of authority, his expression was gentle, blue eyes crinkling at the corners beneath the shadow of his hat brim. "Marshal Quincy." Grace nodded formally. "How may I assist you?" "Just wanted to introduce myself, madam. Part of my job is looking after the schoolhouse. Some of the older boys can get rowdy." His voice carried the drawl of the Southwest, unhurried and warm. "Also wanted to warn you about coyotes. They've been bold lately, coming close to town. Best not to walk alone after dark." Grace appreciated the warning but felt a flicker of annoyance at the implication she couldn't care for herself. "Thank you, Marshal. I'll bear that in mind." He nodded, seeming to sense her independence. "Town's having a social Saturday night. Good way to meet folks before school starts." He replaced his hat, the movement practiced and fluid. "Welcome to Nogales, Miss Sullivan." After he left, Grace found herself staring at the door, strangely unsettled by the brief encounter. Marshal Quincy wasn't what she'd expected from a frontier lawman. There was a quietness to him, a thoughtfulness behind his eyes that contradicted the rough image painted by dime novels. The afternoon passed in productive solitude. As Grace locked the schoolhouse and started back toward the boarding house, the wind kicked up, sending tumbleweeds skittering across the street. That sound returned the hollow, mournful howl that seemed to reach inside her chest. Tears pricked her eyes and she hurriedly wiped them away, embarrassed even with no one to witness her weakness. What was it about that sound that affected her so? "Gets to you, doesn't it?" The voice startled her. Marshal Quincy stood nearby, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Grace composed herself quickly. "It's just wind, Marshal." "Is it?" He looked toward the distant mountains. "Folks around here say differently. Some call it the breath of the dead. Others say it's just heaven talking back." Grace stiffened. "I don't believe in superstitions." "Didn't say you had to believe it." A small smile touched his lips, just offering another way of hearing it. Before she could respond, he tipped his hat and continued down the street, boots raising puffs of dust with each step. Heaven talking back. The phrase stayed with Grace through dinner and into the evening as she prepared her lessons. It was nonsense, of course, the kind of fanciful thinking her father had always dismissed. Dr. Sullivan had been a man of facts, of measurable evidence. Wind was merely air moving across land, created by temperature differentials and Earth's rotation. Yet as night fell and the wind returned, keening around the eaves of the boarding house, Grace found herself at the window, listening. If heaven could talk back, what would her father say? Would he tell her she'd been right to come west? Would he be proud of her courage or concerned for her safety? "Foolishness," she whispered, turning away from the window. But the tears came anyway, silent and unstoppable. Monday arrived with the nervous energy Grace always felt on first days. She rang the school bell at 8 o'clock sharp, watching as children emerged from various directions, some from town homes, others riding in on ponies or arriving in farm wagons. They filed in with curious eyes, taking their seats according to age. The youngest children, wide-eyed and fidgeting, sat at the front. The oldest boys claimed the back row with the swaggering confidence of youth approaching manhood. "Good morning. I am Miss Sullivan, your new teacher." Grace wrote her name on the blackboard in her neat hand. "We'll begin by learning each other's names." The morning progressed smoothly. The children were generally well behaved, if somewhat behind in their studies, as Mrs. Hargrove had warned. By noon recess, Grace had assessed reading levels and arithmetic knowledge, finding the range considerable. She stood watching them play in the schoolyard when a movement caught her eye. Marshal Quincy sat on horseback at the edge of the property, observing the proceedings. When he noticed her attention, he nodded once, then turned his mount and rode slowly back toward town. The rest of the day passed in a blur of lessons, corrections, and getting to know her pupils. By dismissal time, Grace's voice was hoarse, and her feet ached from standing, but she felt a sense of accomplishment. As the last child departed, the wind began to rise. The desert air, which had been still and hot all day, suddenly stirred, bringing the scent of sage and dust. The familiar hollow sound started as a whisper, building gradually. Grace was tidying the classroom when it reached its crescendo, that mournful, keening howl that seemed to carry voices just beyond comprehension. She froze, chalk still in hand, as tears welled in her eyes. "Just wind," she whispered fiercely. "Just air moving across land." But the tears fell anyway, tracking silently down her cheeks as she continued her work with trembling hands. Days melted into a pattern. Grace taught, the children learned, and she gradually adjusted to frontier life. She met townsfolk at the Saturday social, where she danced precisely twice, once with the elderly shopkeeper and once with Marshal Quincy, whose hand at her waist had been respectful yet somehow disconcerting in its warmth. Throughout it all, the wind continued to affect her. It wasn't constant. Days might pass in still, sweltering heat. But when it came, especially at dusk, that haunting howl invariably brought tears she couldn't explain or control. One evening, nearly 3 weeks after her arrival, Grace was walking back from the general store when the wind rose suddenly. The paper-wrapped parcel of writing paper clutched to her chest. She hurried her steps, determined to reach the boarding house before anyone witnessed her inexplicable reaction. "Miss Sullivan." Grace looked up to find Marshal Quincy approaching, leading his horse. The animal's coat gleamed copper in the fading light, its dark mane lifting in the wind. "Marshal." She nodded, blinking rapidly to clear her vision. He studied her face. "You're crying, dust in my eyes." She attempted to move past him. "It's the wind, isn't it?" His voice was gentle, without mockery. "It makes you cry." Grace stopped, mortified at being so transparent. "It's foolish, I know. Not foolish." He stepped closer, still leading his horse. "Wind speaks differently to different people." The howl increased, and Grace felt fresh tears spill over. "It reminds me of my father, his last breaths." She hadn't meant to reveal so much, especially not to this man she barely knew. Understanding dawned in his eyes. "When did you lose him?" 3 years ago, pneumonia." She clutched her parcel tighter. "He was a doctor. He spent his life saving others, but no one could save him." The wind gusted stronger, and Grace couldn't suppress a small sob. Marshal Quincy stepped closer still. "It's just heaven talking back, Miss Sullivan. Your father, letting you know he hears you." She should have been offended by such superstition, such presumption. Instead, something in his words unlocked a door within her. "How can you know that? Lost my ma when I was 12, pa when I was 20. He looked toward the darkening sky. "Out here, I learned to listen differently. The wind carries things, if you know how to hear them." Grace wanted to argue, to defend rationality and science as her father would have done. But the wind howled again, and all she could do was cry. "May I see you home, Miss Sullivan?" His voice was so gentle it nearly undid her completely. She nodded, unable to speak through her tears. They walked in silence, the only sounds the crunch of their boots, the occasional snort from his horse, and the persistent wind with its mournful song. At the boarding house steps, she paused. "Thank you, Marshal." "Ridge," he said quietly. "My name is Ridge." The following Sunday afternoon, a knock came at Grace's door. Mrs. Miller stood there, her usual stern expression softened somewhat. "Marshal Quincy is downstairs. Says he has something to show you if you're amenable to a ride." Grace hesitated. Propriety dictated caution about being alone with a man, even one with a marshal's badge. Yet something compelled her. "Please tell him I'll be down shortly." She changed into her riding skirt, a concession to practicality she'd purchased after arriving, and pinned her hair securely beneath a broad-brimmed hat. When she descended, Ridge Quincy stood in the parlor, hat in hand, looking almost boyish in his uncertainty. "Miss Sullivan." He straightened. "I hope I'm not imposing." "Not at all, Marshal." She was acutely aware of Mrs. Miller's interested gaze from the hallway. "You mentioned something to show me." "Yes, madam. It's about a half-hour ride. I've borrowed a gentle mare from the livery for you." Outside, 2 horses waited, his copper-colored gelding and a dappled gray mare with a white blaze. Ridge helped her mount with capable hands, then swung easily into his own saddle. They rode west from town, the desert spreading before them in rippling waves of heat. Saguaro cacti stood like sentinels, their accordion-pleated surfaces expanding and contracting with water storage. Prickly pear and calla dotted the landscape between patches of brittlebush and creosote. "It's beautiful," Grace admitted, watching a red-tailed hawk circle lazily overhead. "In a stark way. Takes time to see it proper," Ridge agreed. "Most Easterners expect trees and grass. Desert beauty is more subtle." They rode in companionable silence, following what appeared to be a game trail winding through arroyos and around rocky outcroppings. Finally, they ascended a gentle slope to a flat-topped mesa overlooking a vast expanse of desert. "Here we are." Ridge dismounted and secured his horse to a stunted mesquite tree. He came around to help Grace down, his hands strong and sure at her waist. The mesa top was surprisingly verdant, with desert wildflowers blooming in crevices between rocks. A natural stone bench formation faced west, toward the distant mountains. "What is this place?" Grace asked, turning slowly to take in the panoramic view. "No special name. Just a place I found my first year as marshal." Ridge gestured toward the stone bench. "Sit if you like, it'll start soon." Curious, Grace settled on the sun-warmed stone. Ridge sat beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. "What will start?" He smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "Just watch and listen." As the sun began its descent toward the jagged mountain peaks, the light changed, casting the desert in gold. Shadows lengthened, stretching like dark fingers across the land. Then, as if on cue, the wind rose. It started gently, a whisper through the brittlebush, a soft touch against her cheek. Then it strengthened, moving across the desert floor in visible waves, stirring dust into dancing spirals. The sound came next, that hollow, mournful howl that had haunted Grace since her arrival. She tensed, waiting for the tears that always followed. "Don't fight it," Ridge said softly beside her. "Just listen differently." Grace closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her. The wind swirled around them, speaking in its wordless voice. Tears formed and spilled, but this time she didn't try to stop them. "What do you hear?" Ridge asked. Grace really listened for the first time. Behind the hollow howl was something else, nuance, variation, almost like voices, she whispered. "So many voices. The old ones say this land remembers everyone who passes through it," Ridge said. "Their stories get caught in the wind." Grace opened her eyes to find him watching her, his expression open and vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. "My father was a man of science," she said. "He didn't believe in such things." "And you?" She considered the question honestly. "I don't know any more, but I know what I feel." The wind gusted stronger, and this time Grace didn't cry. Instead, she listened, trying to distinguish patterns in the sound. There was sorrow there, yes, but also joy, excitement, peace, a whole range of emotions carried on the desert air. "When I first came west," Ridge said, "I was running from memories. Lost both parents, lost a brother in the war. Thought I could outrun grief if I went far enough." He gazed across the landscape. "Instead, I found this. Found that grief doesn't end, it just changes, becomes part of the conversation." Grace studied his profile, seeing beyond the marshal's stern facade to the man beneath. "Is that why you brought me here?" "To teach me to have a conversation with grief." He turned to her, blue eyes serious. "Brought you here because I couldn't bear seeing you fight the tears every time the wind blew. Thought maybe if you heard it different, it might hurt less." The simple kindness of the gesture touched her deeply. No one in her life had ever recognized her grief so clearly or responded to it with such compassion. The sun dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in impossible colors: magenta, gold, deepest orange. The wind continued its song, but Grace heard it differently now. Not as a reminder of loss, but as an ongoing conversation with all that had come before. "Thank you," she said finally, "for showing me this." Ridge nodded, a small smile touching his lips. We should head back before dark. As they mounted their horses for the return journey, Grace felt something shift inside her, not an end to grief, but a transformation of it. A beginning of something new. The weeks that followed brought changes both subtle and profound. Grace settled fully into her role as teacher, finding unexpected satisfaction in the progress of her frontier pupils. She learned to navigate town politics and personalities, from Mrs. Hargrove's rigid propriety to the easy camaraderie of the general store owner who saved primers and pencils especially for her school. And there was Ridge. After their Mesa excursion, their encounters grew more frequent, less coincidental. He would appear at the schoolhouse door with a book he thought she might enjoy, or to fix a broken window latch. She found herself lingering at the general store when she knew he made his afternoon rounds, or taking evening walks that somehow intersected with his patrol. The town noticed. Grace caught the knowing looks from Mrs. Miller, the raised eyebrows from mothers collecting their children after school. Even her pupils whispered and giggled when the marshal approached the schoolyard. "Miss Sullivan, are you sweet on Marshal Quincy?" 10-year-old Abigail Peterson asked boldly one afternoon as Grace supervised recess. "That's not an appropriate question, Abigail," Grace replied, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "My ma says he's sweet on you," the girl persisted. "Says he never paid any mind to Miss Carpenter before you came." Grace wondered briefly about her predecessor but dismissed the thought. "Your mother should not be discussing such matters with you, and you should be playing with your friends." The girl skipped away, satisfied she'd struck a nerve. Was she sweet on the marshal? Grace pondered the question that evening as she graded arithmetic papers. She admired him, certainly. Found him handsome in a rugged way unlike the polished Boston gentleman she'd known. But more than his appearance, she valued his kindness, his quiet strength, the way he saw her grief and didn't try to diminish it. A knock at her boarding house door interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Miller appeared, face pinched with concern. "Miss Sullivan, Marshal Quincy is downstairs. Says there's trouble at the schoolhouse." Grace hurried down to find Ridge in the parlor, his expression grim. "Someone broke in, broke some windows, made a mess of your papers." The children's work, Grace felt sick thinking of the carefully completed assignments. "I've secured the building, but thought you'd want to see the damage. Maybe tell me if anything's missing." The night air was cool as they walked briskly toward the schoolhouse, Ridge's hand at her elbow guiding her through the darkness. The wind was rising again, bringing that familiar sound, but Grace no longer felt tears threaten. Instead, she listened for the layers within it, the voices Ridge had taught her to hear. The schoolhouse was indeed a disaster. Benches overturned, books strewn across the floor, inkwells smashed against the wall leaving dark stains like wounds. Grace's desk had been ransacked, her neatly organized lessons scattered and trampled. Why would someone do this? She knelt to retrieve a child's slate, now cracked across the middle. Ridge surveyed the damage with a lawman's practiced eye. Likely bored cowboys or miners passing through. Sometimes they target the school, thinking it's just mischief. Together they righted benches, salvaged what papers they could, and swept up broken glass. Ridge boarded the windows with planks he'd brought along, promising to have the glazier make repairs the next day. As they worked side by side, Grace found herself watching his hands, strong, capable hands that could aim a revolver with deadly precision, yet moved with gentle care as he collected shredded primer pages. "We'll have it ready for morning," he assured her, misreading her pensiveness for worry. "The children needn't miss a day." "Thank you," she gathered her courage. "Ridge, why are you helping me like this? Sheriff duties aside, you've been kind to me since I arrived." He paused in his work, considering her question with the deliberation she'd come to recognize as fundamental to his character. "At first, because you seemed so alone," he said finally. "Reminded me of myself when I first came west. Then because I saw how the wind made you cry and I couldn't bear it." He met her eyes directly. "Now, because I care for you, Grace, more than I should, perhaps." The honesty of his answer took her breath away. "I care for you too," she admitted quietly. The wind howled around the schoolhouse, but this time, Grace heard something new in it, possibility, perhaps. Or hope. Ridge stepped closer, his eyes asking a question. When she didn't move away, he reached up slowly, giving her every chance to withdraw, and touched her cheek with calloused fingers. "May I court you properly, Miss Sullivan? Sunday dinners, walks after church, all above board and respectable." Grace smiled, covering his hand with her own. "I'd like that very much, Marshal Quincy." Their courtship progressed with the measured pace of people who understood the value of building something lasting. Ridge called at the boarding house on Sundays, escorted Grace to church socials, and occasionally accompanied her on supervised outings that always, somehow, included a moment when the wind would rise and they could listen together to its many-layered voice. Grace learned his story in pieces: how he'd come west after losing his family in Tennessee, worked as a ranch hand before becoming a deputy in Tucson, then marshal in Nogales 3 years ago. He'd been engaged once, years before, to a rancher's daughter who died of influenza before they could marry. "Is that why you understood my grief so well?" Grace asked one Sunday as they sat in the church garden under Mrs. Miller's watchful eye. "Partly," Ridge admitted. "But it was more how you tried to hide it, like it was something shameful. Reminded me of myself." Grace told him of Boston, of her father's medical practice, of the debts that had forced her to seek employment far from home. She described her mother's death when she was only 8, her father's dedication to raising her alone, the pneumonia that took him so quickly she barely had time to say goodbye. He would have hated Arizona, she confessed with a small laugh. The dust, the heat, the superstitions. He was so rational, so scientific. "And yet he raised a daughter who listens to the wind," Ridge observed with a smile. "Because of you," she reminded him. He shook his head. "No, the ability was always in you. I just gave it a different name." As summer heat gave way to autumn's milder temperatures, their relationship deepened. The town accepted their courtship as inevitable, though Mrs. Hargrove frequently reminded Grace that any marriage would terminate her teaching contract. "We cannot have married women teaching impressionable children," she insisted, though her eyes betrayed approval of Ridge as a match. One crisp October evening, Ridge invited Grace for a sunset ride. Mrs. Miller, now fully supportive of the relationship, agreed to chaperone from a discreet distance. They returned to the mesa where he had first shown her how to listen to the wind. As the golden light bathed the desert, Ridge took both her hands in his. "Grace Sullivan, I've known since that first day when I saw you crying in the wind that you were someone special. I never thought I'd find love again after losing Hannah, but you've shown me that the heart can heal and grow." He drew a deep breath. "I'm not a wealthy man or a learned one, but I promise to cherish you, protect you, and listen with you to whatever the wind wants to tell us. Will you be my wife?" Tears filled Grace's eyes, but for once they had nothing to do with grief. "Yes, Ridge. Yes, I will." He kissed her then, a gentle touch of lips that promised more as the wind rose around them in what Grace could only interpret as approval. Their wedding took place in December, a simple ceremony in the whitewashed church with the entire town in attendance. Grace wore a cream-colored dress she'd sewn herself, with Mrs. Miller's help. Ridge looked handsome and slightly uncomfortable in a new black suit, his marshal's badge polished to a high shine on his chest. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the pastor declared, and the townsfolk erupted in cheers and applause. The school board had indeed required Grace's resignation, effective immediately, though they expressed hope that she might tutor children privately or perhaps return if the need became dire. Grace found she didn't mind. She and Ridge had purchased a small adobe house on the edge of town, and she looked forward to making it a home. That night, in the privacy of their new home, Ridge held her close as the desert wind swirled around their sturdy walls. "Happy," he whispered against her hair. "More than I ever thought possible," she answered truthfully. The wind howled, that once mournful sound now familiar and almost comforting. Grace listened to the voices within it, joy, sorrow, memory, hope, all blending into a conversation that would continue as long as the desert endured. She cried just a little at the beauty of it. "It's just heaven talking back," Ridge murmured, understanding as always. "Blessing us." And Grace, who had once believed only in what could be measured and proven, found herself agreeing with her whole heart. Spring brought new beginnings to Nogales. The desert bloomed with unexpected wildflowers, riots of color against the sun-baked earth. The border town grew busier as trade increased with the better weather, bringing new faces and opportunities. Grace stood at the window of their home, watching as Ridge mounted his horse for morning patrol. Her hand rested on the gentle swell of her belly, still small enough to conceal beneath her apron but growing steadily. They hadn't announced the pregnancy yet, though Mrs. Miller had given her knowing looks when Grace declined coffee at their weekly visits. As Ridge rode away, the wind picked up, stirring the kitchen curtains Grace had sewn. The familiar sound wrapped around her, and she smiled, listening for the layered voices within it. Sometimes she thought she could distinguish her father's tone, practical, loving, proud among the chorus. Other times, she heard voices she didn't recognize, perhaps Ridge's parents or his lost fiancée, all part of the ongoing conversation. The months passed in domestic contentment. Grace, though no longer teaching formally, found herself with a steady stream of pupils coming to her kitchen table for extra help with difficult subjects. She started a small lending library from her book collection, which grew as Ridge surprised her with volumes ordered from Tucson or even San Francisco. Their son was born on a blustery September day, entering the world with lusty cries that nearly drowned out the howling wind outside. They named him Robert after Grace's father, with James as a middle name to honor Ridge's father. "He's perfect," Ridge whispered, cradling the infant with careful hands that trembled slightly. "Perfect like his mother." Grace, exhausted but radiant, watched her husband with their child. "He has your eyes." "Poor boy," Ridge joked, though his voice was thick with emotion. That night, as baby Robert slept in his cradle beside their bed, the wind rose to a ferocious howl, rattling windows and doors. Grace woke, instantly alert for her child's cry, but Robert slept peacefully through the din. Ridge stirred beside her. "Wind's got something to say tonight." Grace listened, hearing in the sound not menace but celebration. "It's welcoming him," she said with certainty. Ridge pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Your father would be proud of both of you." Tears came then, but they were sweet tears, healing tears. "I know," Grace whispered. "I can hear him in the wind." Life settled into new rhythms with Robert's arrival. Ridge continued his duties as marshal, but arranged his schedule to be home more often. Grace balanced motherhood with her informal teaching and the household duties that seemed to multiply with an infant. The town changed too. The railroad came closer, bringing increased commerce and population. New buildings rose along the main street, and talk circulated of Arizona becoming a state within a few years. Through it all, Grace and Ridge's bond deepened. They developed the private language of long-married couples, a look that conveyed paragraphs, a touch that held conversations. And always, they shared their unique connection to the desert wind, teaching Robert as he grew to listen for the voices carried on the air. "Mama, who's talking?" 3-year-old Robert would ask when the wind howled around their home. "Just heaven talking back," Grace would answer, echoing Ridge's words from years before. "All the people who loved us before we were born, telling us they're still watching over us." Robert accepted this explanation with a child's easy faith, often sitting on the porch with his parents during windstorms, his small face solemn as he concentrated on hearing the voices. When Robert was 4, Grace gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl they named Thomas and Elizabeth. The family of 5 filled their adobe house to bursting, and Ridge began work on an addition, adding 2 more rooms with his own hands. "We'll need the space," Grace told him one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset while the children played in the yard. "I'm teaching 6 students now, and Mrs. Hargrove hinted that with the town growing so quickly, they may ask me to return to the schoolhouse part-time." Ridge looked at her with surprise. "Would you want that? With the little one still so young?" "Not yet," Grace admitted. "But in a year or 2, perhaps. I miss it sometimes, the classroom, the children's minds opening to new ideas." Ridge took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Whatever you decide, I'll support you. You know that." She did know. In 5 years of marriage, Ridge had never once dictated her choices or limited her independence. It was one of the countless reasons she loved him more with each passing day. That night, after the children were asleep, a particularly strong wind arose, howling around the house with unusual intensity. Grace stood at the window, listening. "What do you hear?" Ridge asked, coming to stand behind her, his arms encircling her waist. "Change," she said after a moment. "Something's coming." The premonition proved accurate. The following week brought news that would alter the course of their lives. The territorial governor appointed Ridge as sheriff of the entire county, a position of greater responsibility and authority, based in Tucson. "I haven't accepted yet," Ridge told Grace that evening. "It would mean moving, uprooting the children, you leaving your students. We'd need to discuss it thoroughly." Grace considered the opportunity carefully. Tucson was larger, more established, with better schools for their children as they grew. The position would be safer in many ways than being marshal of a border town, yet more challenging in others. "What does your heart tell you?" she asked. Ridge's expression grew thoughtful. "That I could do good work there, that our family would have opportunities we can't give them here." Grace nodded. "Then we should go. You wouldn't mind leaving Nogales? This house we've built together," she smiled, touching his cheek. "Ridge Quincy, haven't you learned by now that home isn't a place? It's the people you love." They moved to Tucson in the spring of 1900, settling into a handsome brick house near the courthouse. The children adjusted quickly, making friends in the neighborhood and thriving in their new schools. Grace found a position teaching literature at a young ladies' academy, 3 afternoons a week, hours that allowed her to be home when her children returned from their own classes. Ridge excelled as sheriff, bringing his quiet strength and unwavering integrity to the role. His reputation for fairness spread throughout the county, earning him respect from citizens and lawmakers alike. The only adjustment Grace struggled with was the wind. Tucson had its share of desert breezes, but they lacked the distinctive hollow howl of Nogales. The first time she realized this, standing in their new garden, she felt a pang of loss so acute it took her breath away. "I can't hear them," she told Ridge that night. The voices in the wind, they're different here." He held her close, understanding as always. "We'll visit the mesa. It's not so far a day's ride, and perhaps with time you'll learn to hear the Tucson voices too." He was right, of course. Gradually, Grace's ears adjusted to Tucson's different wind song. It was gentler here, less dramatic but no less meaningful once she learned to listen properly. And true to his word, Ridge arranged for them to visit Nogales several times a year, always including a trip to their special mesa where the wind spoke most clearly. On one such visit, when Robert was 10 and the twins 6, they brought the children to the mesa at sunset. The 5 of them sat on the stone bench, watching as the desert transformed in golden light. "Close your eyes and listen," Grace instructed the children. "Tell me what you hear." The wind rose right on cue, swirling around them with its familiar hollow song. "I hear Grandfather Sullivan," Robert said confidently after a moment. "He's talking about science and medicine." "I hear laughing," Elizabeth contributed, "like lots of people having a party." "I hear horses," Thomas decided, "running fast across the desert." Ridge caught Grace's eye over their children's heads, his expression tender. After 12 years together, they could still communicate volumes in a single glance. This one said clearly, "We did this. We created this family, this love, this legacy." Grace smiled back, her heart full to bursting. From that first day when she'd arrived in Nogales, crying inexplicably at the sound of the wind, to this moment surrounded by the family she and Ridge had built together, it had been an extraordinary journey. The wind gusted stronger, carrying with it all the voices of their shared past. Grace listened, hearing now not just her father but a chorus of those who had come before Ridge's parents, her mother, even Hannah, Ridge's first love, who had blessed their union in her own way. "It's just heaven talking back," she whispered, as tears of gratitude traced paths down her cheeks. Ridge's arm tightened around her shoulders, and together they watched the sunset paint the desert in impossible colors, their children's voices rising with the wind in a joyful conversation that would continue long after they were gone. Years passed, bringing changes both expected and surprising. Robert followed in his namesake grandfather's footsteps, studying medicine in California before returning to Arizona to establish a practice in Tucson. Thomas joined the newly formed Arizona Rangers, serving with distinction across the territory. Elizabeth, to everyone's surprise except her own, became one of the first women to attend the University of Arizona, studying botany with a special focus on desert plants. Ridge and Grace watched their children forge their paths with pride, offering guidance when asked, but allowing them the freedom to make their own choices. Their home remained the family anchor, the place where everyone gathered for holidays and celebrations. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children surprised them with a special gift: a trip back to Nogales and their beloved mesa, where everything had begun. "We've reserved rooms at the hotel," Robert explained. "The whole family, including my Sarah and the children, Thomas and his Francine, and Elizabeth with Professor Davis." "You planned all this?" Grace asked, touched beyond words. "It was Elizabeth's idea," Thomas admitted. "She said we needed to hear the wind where it speaks clearest." The journey was easier now, made by automobile rather than horseback, though Grace found herself missing the slower pace that had allowed her to absorb the changing landscape. Nogales had grown considerably, the border town now a bustling city with paved streets and electric lights. Their old adobe house still stood, though it had new owners and an added second story. The schoolhouse had been replaced by a larger brick building that served the expanded population. Only the mesa remained unchanged, standing sentinel over the desert as it had for centuries. The extended Quincy family, 15 strong now, including grandchildren, made the trek up the gentle slope as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. Ridge, his hair now silver but his back still straight, helped Grace to their familiar stone bench. "Remember the first time you brought me here?" she asked softly. Ridge nodded, his blue eyes still bright in his weathered face. "You were fighting so hard not to cry when the wind blew, breaking my heart watching you. And you told me it was just heaven talking back." She squeezed his hand. "Changed everything for me, those words." Their children and grandchildren settled around them, the little ones fidgeting with excitement at this mysterious family pilgrimage their parents had described as magical. As if on cue, the wind began to rise, bringing with it that distinctive hollow howl that had been the soundtrack to Grace and Ridge's love story. Grace closed her eyes, listening for the familiar voices her father, Ridge's parents, others who had joined the chorus over the years. "What do you hear, grandmother?" asked Robert's eldest daughter, 7-year-old Pearl. Grace opened her eyes to find the child watching her intently. "I hear love, sweet girl. All the love that came before us and all the love that will follow after we're gone." The child nodded solemnly, then closed her eyes to listen for herself. Ridge's arm circled Grace's shoulders, drawing her close against his side. After 3 decades together, his touch still filled her with warmth and security. "Happy?" he asked, echoing the question he'd first posed on their wedding night. Grace looked around at their assembled family, the children they'd raised, the partners those children had chosen, the grandchildren carrying their legacy forward. She thought of the journey that had brought them to this moment, from a grief-stricken young woman arriving alone in a frontier town to this matriarch surrounded by love. "Beyond measure," she answered truthfully. The wind swirled around them, carrying the voices of the past and whispers of the future. Grace cried just a little at the beauty of it all. "It's just heaven talking back," Ridge murmured, his lips against her temple, "blessing us still." And Grace, who had once believed only in what could be measured and proven, knew with absolute certainty that he was right.